Welcome to the Capital Brief. I'm Seth Berenzweig, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. I'd like to once again say hello to my colleague, John Tamny. John, how are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so initial quick check. Have you yet voted, or do you plan to vote on Election Day?
I plan to vote on Election Day, which means I may not be able to vote if the lines are to be to believe, but that is the plan as of now.
Well, thus far we've got, we're heading towards about 75 million or so who will be casting a ballot before Election Day, and it's really a historic time frame. So we'll be talking about the state of the economy and how everything blends together in the world of politics and business. So great to see you again today.
Yes.
So, John, let's get right into it. As we sit here today, we are really in a pivotal moment in American history. I took a look at the screen today on the stock market as I was getting some final notes together, and I couldn't help but notice that all the major indices were down roughly 3%. The market is down sharply. The daily new cases of COVID are up sharply, and the dissonance between the campaigns in terms of setting the table of where we are could not be more separate. We have the president saying that we're rounding the bend, we're turning the corner, we're going to have a vaccine, and it's going to be a big and beautiful economy. We have his challenger saying that we're heading into a dark winter and that difficult days lie ahead. Now, I'm sure both sides are guilty of a bit of hyperbole here, so I'm not going to just cast blame on one side or the other. But can you set the table for us as we sit here today in our unique state of American economy and politics? How would you describe where we are as we sit here today, just days out from a historic presidential election?
Well, it cannot be stressed enough that the only closed U.S. economy is the U.S. economy. And so think about this. California itself, if it were a standalone entity, would be the fifth largest economy in the world. Yet a major shutdown took place there. And so when you look at that, it's no surprise that the U.S. economy overall would be struggling. Now, I think what people point to is they say, but the stock market says something differently. And the stock market is never a snapshot of the present. It's a snapshot of the future. The expectation in the markets is that while we've made grave errors, if you want to call that, or while we've contracted substantially in the here and now, fairly soon people are going to get back at it. They're going to get back to work. And so the stock market is pricing in a fairly abundant future in terms of economic growth, regardless of who's in the White House.
Well, I've always been fascinated to see the White House continue to point to the stock market because while it's certainly a factor that's not irrelevant, it doesn't really have a major significance in most Americans' lives. Especially during the era of the pandemic, we're really seeing a dichotomy of two Americas. We see, for example, the people who are able to go out for dinner, for a nice dinner and a nice bottle of wine, who take their face masks off as soon as they sit at the dinner table. And then we see the waiters and waitresses and the line cooks that have to wear their mask all night and that are serving us. Now, certainly, I'm not going to suggest that we shouldn't go and do that because we want to support our local businesses and especially small restaurants. But the stock market, as you're noting, isn't really the best barometer of really where we are right now and certainly where we're headed. And if you want to look at the stock market, there's a lot of red on the screen today. But what do you believe is going to be the best short-term thing to address as far as plugging some help into the economic engine? There's talk between Mnuchin and Pelosi. There's not going to be a stimulus. There is going to be stimulus. It's a definite maybe. Where do you think that needs to go right now? Or do you think at this point it's just something that is not going to have a material impact and might as well wait until January?
Well, I would stress that there's no such thing as stimulus. They talk about stimulating the economy with government spending, but
Right.
Governments only have money to spend insofar as the economy is already growing. Government spending is a consequence of economic growth. So to say that we could stimulate it by spending money that we've extracted from the economy first is a monument to double counting. The growth already occurred, or the growth is already expected to occur. That's why government has funds to spend. And so I think it's a mistake whenever we say, well, if Mnuchin and Pelosi get together and they come up with a big spending package, as a rule, that's not going to grow the economy, because suddenly you're extracting precious resources from the economy and letting politicians hand them out in politicized fashion. If you want to grow the economy, the only way to do it is to leave those resources in the private sector.
So are you talking about tax policy, perhaps among other things? Because obviously the government both brings money in and then flushes money out. Moving away from expenditures for a moment, you're saying that the government can only stimulate with cash that it already has or needs to take from somewhere else. So are you directly or indirectly referring to tax policy?
It might surprise you that I'm not. My view right now is that the problem is there's too much policy. There's an expectation from both sides that we must do something. And I reject the assumption, because let's look back to February 23rd. Was anyone calling for a stimulus plan back then? Well, no, and the reason they weren't calling for it is because the economy was just fine. What's changed since then? Well, in many parts of the U.S., including some of the most productive parts of the U.S., there have been lockdowns of economic activity. There have been barriers put up. So to say that we need policy to fix the economy is like saying, oh, you've got a broken leg, let's put a Band-Aid on it. No, we just need less of what was already happening. And so to pretend that we can then grow the economy now by empowering Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and Kevin McCarthy defies, I think, basic economic logic. Shrink the control of resources by government and let people start working. So I love tax cuts, but I think tax cuts are a non sequitur right now.
So you think the answer is more of just letting the business doors get unlocked and open and just letting the market forces get back to normal, as opposed to the bureaucrats in Washington sitting down over hundreds of pages worth of policies and procedures on stimulus and spending more money that the government doesn't even have available to spend?
Yeah, no, without question. You don't fix a problem of command and control. That's why the economy contracted, with more command and control. You don't grow the economy by handing politicians, doesn't matter whether Republican or Democrat, more resources to allocate in the economy in politicized fashion. Let's go back to 1920 and 21. That was a massive recession, but you don't hear about it relative to 1929 and 30. And the reason you don't was that the response from government was actually less than nothing. Federal spending was $6.4 billion in 1920. It fell all the way to $3.3 billion in 1923. And the idea was the economy is weak, so let's shrink the government's footprint. And so the economy took off. Unemployment was at 11.3% in 1920. It fell all the way to 1.7 in 1923. Recessions and contractions, you don't fix them by empowering politicians more. That's how you slow the rebound. And
empower business, not Washington.
Yeah, and right. The reason for that is obvious. If you wanted to grow the economy, would you hand the money over to Mitch McConnell, or would you hand it over to Jeff Bezos? It's not a partisan thing.
Sure.
It's just we know where the growth comes from. It's a consequence of investment, so leave the resources in the private sector.
Well, we could argue that what happened this summer is a case in point that supports your thesis, because we had a very fresh round of stimulus. We had an additional $600 a week in benefits to folks who were not able to go back to work. And that was, and I hate people using this phrase, but it was like a short-term sugar high where we were able to keep certain things afloat. But now here we are again, because that stimulus ran out, the benefits ran out, and now we're in a morning where the virus is spiking, the market is tanking, and here we go. It's like the old saying, it's deja vu all over again. I think that there are some things in the long run that can provide some moderate help from a stimulus standpoint in terms of development of jobs, in terms of new infrastructure. I remember, it feels like 80 years ago, but I remember President Trump talking about how we're going to see infrastructure week. It kind of ended up feeling like Shark Week on the Discovery Channel. You hear about it, but then you wonder whatever happened to it. So I don't know what happened with infrastructure, but are there some? So in other words, if we have President Biden who's going to get sworn in on January 20th after he kind of politely shows President Trump the door, and if President Biden turned to you and said, "What's the one thing I can do today to turn this mess around?" what would it be?
Well, I'd first say you can only stimulate the depressed by depressing the stimulated. All government spending is the process whereby you shift money from one set of pockets to another. And after that, I would say, President Biden, you said something important, that rich people are just as patriotic as poor people. That this idea that they somehow hate America defies common sense. And so from that, let's state the obvious. You want jobs. All politicians want jobs. How are they created? Well, jobs in the companies that create jobs are the remuneration of abstinence. Unspent wealth is what drives job creation. It's that simple. Without people saving and investing, there are no new companies and no jobs. And so while the expectation is that your first plan is to redistribute wealth or raise taxes on the rich, how about say, I'm going to get my government out of the way of those most capable of creating jobs, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos, whether it's Fred Smith, Republican or Democrat. Rich people, precisely because they've got so much unspent wealth, can put their wealth to work.
Well, I think there's a lot of merit to what you're saying. I would vary a bit in certain respects. I think that some stimulus and some involvement by the government would have a positive impact. I think, for example, creating some kind of an infrastructure stimulus to give people new jobs would be helpful. I think the federal government creating a contact tracing center, which frankly is badly needed as part of a missing national plan for battling COVID, is something that would not only help tamp down new cases, but would create more jobs. And the government still really hasn't done a very good job in terms of injecting a little bit of capital on the municipal level so that we can make sure that the first responders are fully funded. PPP was great for small business, and it's a little bit surprising to me that some of it is still available. But I am surprised that the feds have not come in with at least a little bit of stimulus and a little bit of assistance in that front, although I think Nancy Pelosi is a pretty sharp politician, and I don't really sense a lot of energy on her part to try to give the Republicans a break to try to push something through prior to Election Day.
Yeah, as always with government spending, it's very politicized, and so both sides are going to dig in their heels. To me, that's ultimately a good thing. Gridlock is the friend of economic growth. The problem is when both sides are getting along because they're invariably spending a lot more. Let's never forget, it was politicians who, on the local, state, and national level, who forced a contraction of the economy. So how very odd that we're empowering the same political class to extract trillions from the economy, from growth that already occurred, to then throw money at the problems of their creation. Let's never get back to the basic truth that any governmental response right now is not only excessive in consideration of the damage that they've done on all levels, but let's also point out that it's a non sequitur. Who was calling for government plans to grow the economy in February? No reasonable person was, simply because the economy was already growing. How awful for Biden back then to have run against what was a broadly good economy. It brings to mind the late Fred Thompson. He didn't run for president in the year 2000. He said, the reason I'm not, he says, I don't want to go around the country and have to explain to people why things are so awful. It's kind of a challenge to do. And so to me, the answer is always not policy, but the natural state of free people is to grow.
Well, one of the best ways for the government to be able to help the business doors open across the country is to have some kind of a tangible, real, specific policy and strategy with regard to COVID. The government can do things without spending much money at all. It can have certain mandates. It can have certain regulations to be able to bring the virus down. And really, it's going to be very difficult for business to, borrow a phrase, turn the corner or round the bend if we don't get this virus behind us, and hopefully we'll be able to get some help somehow, among other things, including a vaccine. Let me move on to get into another area. We're right around the corner to the election, and of course, we're looking not only at the election for what's going to be the impact on the White House, but also, among other things, the United States Senate. I know there's a crack in your crystal ball, but where do you think things are going to go? And specifically, what do you think is going to happen in the Senate? Because even if Joe Biden gets in there, which is still a big if, he's not going to get anything through if Mitch McConnell is still minding the door.
Yeah, you point out exactly the way I see it, and what you're saying is why I'm so optimistic. The reality is that the expectation for now is that Republicans will keep the Senate, regardless of what happens with the White House. And if that's true, we're going to get gridlock, which I think is generally a very good thing. When Washington does less, and I would add, when Republicans are out of power, they tend to discover their limited government instincts that disappear while they're in power. And so I think with that, if the footprint of government's less, there's going to be more resources in the private sector that can be directed toward interesting, innovative ideas. And so to me, I would take divided government with President Biden in office or President Trump in office any day of the week over one party being in power, in control of all three branches.
Well, it's interesting because right now we have, of course, a Republican White House and a Republican Senate. Aside from the stimulus that came and went like the wind, there really isn't anything happening right now in terms of stimulus or in terms of additional spending. So ironically, we have a little bit of gridlock right now. I certainly agree with you. If the Democrats take over the White House, then there'll be more of that. So needless to say, you don't see a so-called blue sweep coming in and taking over Washington over the next couple of weeks.
I think if we saw a blue sweep coming, we would have seen it in a correction in stock markets long before now, that they would have been pricing this negativity long ago. And that's not a knock on Democrats, or it's just generally when one party has a lot of power, that's not good for the economy because there are fewer checks on their ability to make policy. Let's say that happens. Let's say a blue sweep, it's Biden, they can get control of the Senate, they get the control of the House. Historically, what happens in those instances is that they overreach. We saw that with Bill Clinton in 1992. We saw that with Barack Obama in 2009. The party in power overreaches. We saw that with George W. Bush, and so the electorate corrects it back. And so, and to me, that's very healthy.
How do you deal with the national debt without raising taxes? I know that this is not an easy question. I mean, it's almost an unfair question. It's so intricate. We have over $27 trillion in national debt. That averages out to over $80,000 per person in America, which, and there are some numbers that are in variance in terms of what I've seen online, but that's about 80% plus of GDP. Regardless of whether we have stimulus spending or not, what should Washington do to try to address that critical problem? And is that even a problem to begin with?
Well, it's clearly not a problem. And I say that as someone who wants very limited government. Let's never forget, in 1980, the total national debt was under $1 trillion, yet the yield on the 10-year Treasury was 11%. That was market's way of saying that we're not very confident in the ability of the U.S. Treasury to pay this back. Fast forward 40 years, it's $27 trillion, and the yield on the 10-year is under 1%. That's the market saying that not only are you going to pay this back, you're going to pay this back with ease. The United States is backed by the most productive people on earth. The paradoxical truth is that we have lots of national debt precisely because government collects way too much in revenue right now, not to mention the market expectation that it's going to collect exponentially more in the future. If you want to shrink the national debt, and I don't worry about debt, I worry about total dollars spent, the only way to do it, in my mind, is to massively shrink the inflow of dollars coming into Treasury in the first place.
So you're saying shrink the inflow of dollars versus shrink the expenditures of the outflow of dollars. Is that what you're saying?
100%. That's what I'm saying. Let's never.
Isn't that counterintuitive, though? Because, I mean, well, first of all, weren't the Republicans supposed to do that? I mean, aren't Republicans all about fiscal discipline and fiscal policy?
They're about fiscal discipline rhetorically, but in terms of policy, politicians exist to spend money. And why do they? They want to have a cushy retirement in the way that you do. And so there's no gain to be had in terms of retirement and long-term living if you simplify the tax code or you shrink the size and scope of government. So both parties have an incentive to do that. But yet it's somewhat counterintuitive until you remember what is a U.S. Treasury? It's just it's a future claim on government revenues. And so the fact that the Treasury can borrow for so little is a sign that investors around the world think Treasury not only is collecting enormous sums right now, but in the future, revenue collections will make the present look very small by comparison. That's why they line up to buy government debt. So if you want to shrink the debt, what you must do is so massively shrink the inflow of dollars into U.S. Treasury that suddenly investors start to question the ability of Treasury to pay that back. To me, it should never be about deficit. Let's ask the basic question. What would we prefer as fiscal conservatives? Would we prefer an annual budget of $5 trillion with all of it in balance, or an annual deficit of $1 trillion on $2 trillion in spending? I know what I would prefer. I'd take that deficit scenario any day of the week, because that's $3 trillion less that Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell are allocating. To me, it's about total government spending, not about the debt.
Well, the thing that really fascinates me and that really frustrates me is just a complete lack of specific guidance and policy from Washington on any of these issues. The national debt is much, much more likely to go from $27 trillion to $30 trillion, as opposed to having some kind of a policy to bring that down. There's no specific plan that I've seen that's very tangible, frankly, from either party on how we're going to handle the national debt. I think that's a real problem. It's got to come down somehow. It can't continue to add up forever. And there continues to be lack of a specific plan about, to use your phrase, opening up the business doors. You know, the president, listen, there's plenty of blame to go around on both sides of the aisle. The thing that surprised me about what the president has been saying on the campaign trail is that I have heard much, much less about what is going to be done to help bring the economy back rather than wishful thinking. And instead, I continue to hear about Hunter Biden's laptop, which is fascinating. I have no idea whether that's true or not. I highly doubt it. But in a way, it really doesn't matter very much, because what's on Hunter Biden's laptop, or whether that's a plant from Rudy Giuliani, isn't going to help get people back to work. It isn't going to help open up the business doors, and it isn't going to bring down the national debt. So I know the president has gone on an approach of everything was great and it's going to be great again. But it just never ceases to amaze me how there are so few solutions that come from Washington. And in the meantime, the election continues to get hit on social media, which gets weaponized. And there's no plan against that either. And we talked about that a little bit the last time we were here, so we won't delve back into that. But whatever happens, we know that there's a huge turnout. And we'll find out next week who is more energized and who is more angry, and who believes in what's going to be the next team to bring us forward. So just to kind of bring it into a conclusion, what's your prediction? Again, I know there's a crack in your crystal ball, but how do you see the makeup of the White House and the Congress going into 2021? And what do you believe are the policies that will be implemented to bring us out of this period? We really need a critical pivot right now. What do you think lies ahead in early 2021?
Well, my sense is that it's going to surprise. I think Donald Trump is going to win.
Really?
I don't say that as a fan one way or the other. I don't like politicians.
Why do you think he's going to win?
Because I think overall there is a view that he is better for the economy. Right or wrong, I think there's a view. I think there's more energy on his side of the aisle for this. But the fact that I'm predicting his victory means that you should put all your money on Joe Biden, because I've never been right about these things before. My sense, though, is that either way, no matter what happens, and to the earlier point you made, Trump's made it about Hunter Biden. It's hard to know what Joe Biden has made this election about. It's been issue free, and so neither side is going to come out of this with a mandate. And I think this is a good thing. I say this while agreeing with you. Hunter Biden's a statement of the obvious. If you're in politics, money finds you some way.
Right.
Usually through family members, but invariably if you're in politics and you're powerful, money's going to find you. Why Trump didn't take this time to get around the country and go into every one of those lockdown states and say what's happening to you is wrong. I recognize that there are 50 different governors in the U.S. where states are laboratories of policy, all those great things. But I think this is incorrect. I think this was regressive. I think it hurt the least with the most, as in my base.
Regressive by Trump?
I think the lockdowns in general across the country hurt the poorest. Those who had the temerity to have a job that was a destination, it hurt the most. We could say these in many instances are Trump voters. Why he wasn't doing this from day one, saying that how on earth could they do this to you? Why would they fight a virus with economic desperation? My administration, while it lacks constitutional power to reverse some of this, I'm going to campaign every which way.
Well, I agree with you that both campaigns can be criticized for having a lack of clarity and a lack of policy. I think Joe Biden was basically running on, I'm a good person, I'm a good guy. Although, frankly, that's a message that's resonating right now with at least a part of America. But I will lay out a prediction, and I will disagree with you, and I'll jump out at the end of the fence here and say that I believe that we're going to have a narrow but blue sweep, and it's going to mean that we're going to have a new sheriff in town. In the Senate, it's going to be very close, but we're going to have a new force in Washington that's going to lay out a fiscal stimulus, and it's going to also change the tax rates. It's going to impact the highest earners from an individual basis, and it's going to increase the corporate tax rate up to about 28 or 28.5%. And I think that the American people need some kind of a change. But the biggest change that America needs right now, regardless of party, is that they need to eliminate the division and start to bring about unity. I remember when Trump was running in 2016 and he said, I'm going to be the great uniter. And I remember thinking, if anybody could really do it, it would be Donald Trump. Because if he actually stepped in and took that role, I think that he really would have been a great president. I think if Donald Trump stepped in and really took charge of coronavirus, I think that he would have had a landslide. The fact that we don't have specific mandates and policies in place and that we're not able to open these business doors, it's not all his fault. He didn't create the virus, and it really doesn't all rest on his shoulders, but certainly a part of it does. And the fact that he's throwing people from the CDC and NIH under the bus is a real problem here. So the future implications on this election are going to be huge, and we're really at one of the most historic pivot points in the history of American business and American politics. So I appreciate your thoughts and your predictions on that, and so we'll put it up on the table, and the loser buys the winner a beer. What do you say?
That's right. That means I'll be buying.
We shall see. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.